We've got exclusive new details this morning about Defense Secretary James Mattis and his position in the White House. Sources tell NBC that Mattis is being pushed out of the loop by President Trump on major policy decisions, critical decisions that fall directly under the Defense Secretary's portfolio. Here are a few announcements that caught Mattis by surprise.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. We will be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should. I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces.
NBC national security and military reporter Courtney Kube helped break this story. So I know Dana White, who's the chief spokesperson over at the Pentagon, says this is pure silliness. But lay out the details of your reporting.
So, Chris, Carol Lee, our colleague Carol Lee, and I looked at a series of national security decisions and announcements that President Trump made over the past several months. And one thing that we found in common was that it seemed to lack Secretary Mattis's perspective on many of these. And it's not just that he's necessarily been kept out of the loop on these decisions. It's that President Trump is making a decision that is really contrary to things that Secretary Mattis has said both publicly and privately. So one, you know, the soundbite that you just ran was about a Space Force. Secretary Mattis sent a letter in October of 2017 to Senator John McCain, specifically laying out why he did not think it would be a smart move to establish a sixth branch of the military, what he called a Space Corps. And President Trump, you know, several days ago came out and directed the military to start looking at it. Another thing was the announcement of JCPOA, the Iran deal, when President Trump pulled the U.S. out of it. You ran that soundbite as well. It wasn't necessarily that Secretary Mattis was surprised. There was a lot of speculation for weeks and months that President Trump was going to pull the U.S. out. But the president made the decision without informing Secretary Mattis of it. And administration officials, both current and former, who we spoke with, said that, in fact, Secretary Mattis had to call the White House and say, you know, has the decision been made, so he could find out in advance of the public announcement of it.
Yeah, and just to be clear, even though the Pentagon is saying this is silliness, are they pushing back and saying, oh, that didn't happen? The secretary absolutely knew the president was going to make this announcement, and they had a conversation about it.
So one of the other examples where was the exercises when President Trump, after the historic Singapore summit, announced that the U.S. and South Korea would be canceling their upcoming military exercises, what he called at the time provocative war games. Dana White, the Pentagon spokesperson you mentioned, she came out and said that there were no surprises to Secretary Mattis in that announcement. But officials who we spoke with actually said that President Trump made that decision. They came to the agreement in the summit, and Secretary Mattis found out about the decision and the agreement after the meeting. So he essentially found out about it after Kim Jong-un. Beyond that specific part of our story, though, Chris, the Pentagon's only reaction to it so far has been Dana White's statement, which was, this is pure silliness.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of people who consider Secretary Mattis to be one of the grown-ups in the room, so obviously it's disturbing to them if the president is keeping him out of the loop. But is there a sense of why? Because certainly in the beginning, I mean, the president seemed to just love this guy. You know, Mad Dog was meant as a compliment, exactly the kind of thing that the president wants, is a strong leader. And he always is talking about other people who he considers to be strong leaders. So what happened?
So part of it is the fact that he has two people who he's very close to, two advisors in now Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton. They seem to be the ones that have the most access, the most influence, and they have the president's ear on many of these issues. But we should point out, Chris, we don't have any indication that President Trump is angry at Secretary Mattis, that he's getting ready to fire him, that it's not that at all. It's just that on many of these critical national security issues, the president seems now to be relying more on both Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor, Bolton and President Trump's own feelings and his own perspective on these issues, and less on Secretary Mattis's perspective, Chris.
Great reporting, Courtney. Thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. And up next, we'll go back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.